The kennels were supposed to be off limits. The sign on the chain-link gate said so in 3-inch red letters, and the facility director had said so twice in the last hour. And the 3 staff members standing behind him were nodding with the practiced urgency of people who enforce rules they didn't write. But none of that explained what was happening on the other side of the fence, because on the other side of the fence, 12 retired military working dogs, German shepherds who had served in Kandahar and Ramadi and the Helmand Valley, who had learned over years of deployment never to move toward a stranger without a command, were pressing themselves against the chain link in a single line, whimpering like puppies, tails moving in a furious, helpless arc. And in the middle of all of them, her small hand pushed through the fence, fingers stretched wide, each dog taking a turn to press its muzzle against her palm. She was 8 years old. She was dying. And not one of those dogs had been commanded to come to her. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story stays with you, please subscribe and follow it until the very end. What happens next is something no one in that facility expected, and it will change the way you understand what loyalty really means. We read every single comment, and we want to know how far this story travels. Staff Sergeant Carl Maddox, retired, had spent 14 years inside the United States Marine Corps, doing things that most Americans would not believe, and that he was legally required not to describe in specific detail. He was 43 years old and carried that number differently than most men do, not in gray hair or a softened frame, but in the quality of his stillness. He was 6 feet even, and built with the economical density of someone who had never had the luxury of excess, broad through the chest and narrower at the waist, with close cropped dark hair that had gone silver at both temples in the 18 months since his discharge. His face was plain and arranged with a kind of weathered honesty, not handsome in any conventional sense, but the kind of face that people looked at longer than they planned to, without quite being able to name why. His nose had been broken during an extraction in Helmand Province, and had healed with a slight leftward lean that gave his face its only asymmetry. His hands were large and deliberate, and always slightly scarred at the knuckles. His eyes were the thing people noticed last and remembered longest. They were a pale, clear hazel, not warm, not cold, but measuring. The kind of eyes that had been trained to read rooms the way other people read street signs, cataloging exits and hands and the particular tension in a person's shoulders before they decided what they were going to do. He had looked at difficult things with those eyes for a long time. He had learned, over 14 years, how not to look away. He had served 3 deployments, 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, with the 1st Marine Division's military working dog program, first as a handler and then as a trainer. He had watched dogs find IEDs that would have killed his entire team. He had watched a Belgian Malinois named Duke absorb a bullet in Kandahar that had been aimed at the handler beside Cole and survive it. He had written more after-action reports involving canine units than he could count, and he had developed, over time, a private and specific conviction that the dogs understood more than anyone credited them with, and that the debt owed to them when they came home was not being paid. He'd separated from service with a medical discharge, a spinal injury from a vehicle rollover in the Korengal, and had spent the last year and a half working as a volunteer coordinator for a non-profit that advocated for retired military working dogs. It was not glamorous work. It was not paid, but it was the thing that kept him pointed in a direction, and that was enough. He was at the Clearwater Military Working Dog Transition Facility in rural Montana on a Tuesday in early March, because someone in the organizational chain had finally agreed to let a journalist visit. A woman named Sandra Rios from a veterans advocacy publication, and Cole had driven 4 hours from Missoula to facilitate the visit and make sure nothing went sideways. He had not known Sandra was bringing her daughter. Lily Rios was 8 years old, and she was the kind of child that adults instinctively step back to make room for without understanding the impulse. She was small for her age, had always been small. Her mother had told Cole quietly in the parking lot before they went in, for reasons that she explained briefly, and that Cole had received without comment. The way he had been trained to receive information that required a response other than words. Lily had acute lymphoblastic leukemia. She had been in treatment for 11 months. She was in a period her doctors called consolidation, a phase of chemotherapy maintenance that meant the disease was controlled but not gone, that normal activities were possible in careful increments, and that joy, her mother had said, was not a luxury, but a prescription. She had asked to come because she loved dogs. She had loved dogs her entire short life, with a totality that her mother described as the most purely Lily thing about her. Cole had looked at Lily in the parking lot, at her carefully tied sneakers and her oversized jacket, and the particular alertness of her dark eyes under the wool cap her mother had pulled down over her ears, and had said she was welcome and that he'd make sure the dogs got introduced properly. He had not anticipated what properly was going to mean. The facility director was a man named Gerald Pratt, who had been managing the Clearwater facility for 6 years, and who ran it with the tidy, self-important efficiency of someone who had never been in a situation that his policies couldn't solve. He was in his mid-50s, carefully dressed for a facility that involved kennels and mud, and he had the particular manner of a man who had learned that authority, if stated with enough repetition and eye contact, usually went unchallenged. He had approved the visit on 2 conditions: no physical contact with the animals, and no deviating from the approved tour route. He had a laminated sheet with the route on it. He referred to it twice in the first 15 minutes. The dogs had other ideas. It started with Rex. Rex was a 9-year-old German Shepherd with a titanium tooth on the upper left side, a replacement after a training injury in 2019, and a combat record that included 4 deployments to Afghanistan and 2 confirmed explosive finds that had saved the lives of his handler's entire 12-man patrol. He was currently in the intake kennel, the first stop on the approved tour route, sitting in the back corner of his run with the particular contained alertness of an animal that had learned to trust very little and observe everything. Cole had visited Rex twice before. The dog had tolerated those visits the way he tolerated most things, with professional distance. Lily walked past Rex's kennel without stopping. She was looking at something down the row. Rex stood up. Cole noticed it before anyone else did, the way Rex came off the concrete, not with urgency, but with intention, moving to the front of his run, pressing his nose against the chain link and tracking Lily down the corridor with his eyes. The ears were forward. The tail was moving. Cole had worked with military dogs long enough to know the difference between alert and interest and something else, the third thing that didn't have a good name. The behavior that trainers logged as anomalous and that handlers talked about quietly, among themselves, as the thing the dogs sometimes did when they knew something the humans didn't. "She needs to step back from the runs," Pratt said, appearing at Cole's shoulder with his laminated sheet. "She's 6 feet away from the fence," Cole said, without looking at him. "Protocol requires. Give me a minute," Cole said. The tone was not aggressive. It was the tone of a man who had issued more commands than he'd received and whose voice carried the memory of being listened to. Down the corridor, Lily had stopped. She was standing in front of the run belonging to a 7-year-old shepherd named Ghost, a dog who had served 2 tours in Syria, and who, according to his intake file, had not voluntarily approached a human being since his handler had been medically separated 9 months ago. Ghost was at the front of his run. His tail was moving. He made a sound, low and soft, something between a whimper and a greeting, that Cole had not heard from that dog in either of his previous visits. Lily looked at the dog, She put her hand flat against the chain link. Ghost pressed his muzzle into her palm. "Oh," Lily said. It was barely a word. It was more like the sound a person makes when they recognize something they thought they'd lost. Cole watched this happen. Beside him, Pratt began to say something about contact protocols. Cole put one hand up, open-palmed, without turning. The talking stopped. What happened next took approximately 4 minutes, and Cole watched all of it with the focused quiet of a man cataloging something he understood was significant. One by one, down the length of the corridor, 12 military working dogs moved to the front of their runs, not because they were commanded to, not because there was food or a toy or a familiar handler. They moved because Lily was walking slowly down the row, her hand trailing along the chain link, and each of them wanted to be where her hand was. Rex, Ghost, a 6-year-old named Sarge with a clipped ear and 3 years of bomb detection in Ramadi. A massive black-coated shepherd named Cerberus who had not, according to his file, permitted handling by any staff member since his arrival 5 weeks ago. Cerberus sat at the front of his run and leaned his forehead against the fence and closed his eyes when Lily's fingers found him. "What is she doing?" Pratt said, and his voice had lost the authority it had arrived with. "She's not doing anything," Cole said. "They are." The facility's head trainer, a woman named Karen Elwood, who had worked with military dogs for 20 years and who had been standing at the far end of the corridor watching, walked to where Cole was standing. She didn't say anything for a moment. "I've been here 6 years," she said finally. "I've never seen them do that." "I know," Cole said. Pratt found his voice again. He found it in the form of a statement about liability and insurance and the facility's obligation to the Department of Defense and the terms of the visitor agreement that Sandra Rios had signed in the parking lot. He delivered this statement in the direction of Cole's back because Cole had started walking toward Lily without waiting for permission. The gate at the end of the corridor was locked. Cole was aware of this and was also aware of exactly where Karen Elwood kept her keys because he had been through this facility twice and had paid attention. He did not reach for the keys. He stopped at the gate and crouched to Lily's height, and she turned to look at him with those wide, watchful eyes, and he said, "How are you doing, Lily?" "They're sad," Lily said. She wasn't asking. She said it the way a person states something they have simply observed. "Yes," Cole said. "They are. Because their people left." "That's right." She looked back at the dogs, at the line of them, still pressed to the fence, still watching her. "Do they know their people aren't coming back?" Cole thought about this honestly. "I think they know something changed," he said. "I don't know if they understand why." Lily nodded, the careful nod of a child who has some personal experience with things changing without adequate explanation. "They should get to go somewhere," she said. "Somewhere that feels like theirs." "That's what I'm working on," Cole said. He stood up and turned around. Pratt was 3 feet behind him, and the authority had fully drained from his posture now, replaced by something closer to the expression of a man recalculating. Karen Elwood was standing beside him. Behind her, 2 of the staff members who had been nodding along with Pratt 15 minutes earlier were now watching the dogs through the fence with the softened faces of people who had remembered something. "I need her inside that corridor," Cole said to Karen. It was not a request. Karen Elwood looked at Pratt. Pratt opened his mouth, closed it. "This is highly irregular," he said. "Yes," Cole agreed. "Open the gate." The gate opened. What happened inside that corridor in the next 40 minutes was not in any visitor protocol and was not on any laminated tour sheet. It was, Karen Elwood would say later, the most significant behavioral event she had witnessed in 6 years of working with retired military dogs. Each of the 12 animals was brought out of its run individually, on lead, under controlled handling. Each of them, upon being brought to where Lily stood, performed the same behavior without training or command. They lowered their heads, made contact with her hands or her knees or the hem of her jacket, and held the contact with a gentleness that the files of most of them would not have predicted. Cerberus, the dog who had not permitted handling, sat at Lily's feet and put his head in her lap and did not move for 11 minutes. Lily's mother stood at the end of the corridor with both hands over her mouth and did not take a single photograph, because she understood, without anyone telling her, that some things are not for documentation. Cole watched the whole of it with the particular attention he had learned to pay to things that seemed impossible but were happening in front of him regardless. He had written reports over 14 years about the anomalous behaviors of military working dogs, the way they sometimes found things they hadn't been tasked to find, sat beside people they hadn't been introduced to, refused commands that would have resulted in harm. He had logged these behaviors with the careful language of someone who did not want to be dismissed as credulous. Now he was watching 12 of them, one by one, choose a terminally ill 8-year-old child with the collective certainty of animals who had spent their careers making decisions in conditions of incomplete information and had never once been wrong about what mattered. He went to find Gerald Pratt. He found him in the administrative office at the end of the facility's main building, sitting at his desk with his laminated tour sheet folded in his hands, looking at the wall. Cole sat down across from him without being invited and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "I want to talk to you about a program," Cole said. He talked for 22 minutes. He had been building the framework for 18 months, a structured visitation model for the nonprofit, pairing retired military working dogs with children in pediatric care facilities, using the same behavioral protocols developed for therapy dog certification, but calibrated for the specific needs of post-deployment military canines. He had the documentation. He had the training protocols. He had 3 child life specialists in Missoula and Billings who had agreed to consult. He had not been able to get a facility to agree to a pilot. He had not known, before this morning, that the pilot had effectively already run itself. Pratt listened. The laminated sheet was still in his hands. When Cole finished, Pratt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The dogs have never done anything like what happened out there today. I know. In 6 years, I know." Pratt put the laminated sheet down on his desk. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man watching something become irrelevant. "What do you need from me?" he said. Cole told him. 3 weeks later, the first formal session of what would eventually be called the Sentinel Visitation Program took place in the East Corridor of the Clearwater facility. It involved 6 retired military working dogs, 3 pediatric patients from the St. Patrick Hospital system in Missoula, 2 child life specialists, Karen Elwood and Cole Maddox, who facilitated the session with the careful, unhurried attention of someone doing the most important work of his life. Lily Rios was not cleared to participate in the first session. Her treatment schedule wouldn't allow it. She sent a drawing instead, which Karen taped to the wall at the entrance of the East Corridor, where the dogs would pass it coming out of their runs. It showed 12 dogs in a row, each one a slightly different shade of brown and black crayon, with a small figure in the middle holding both arms out wide, and above the whole thing, in careful capital letters in the handwriting of a child who was learning to make her letters exactly right, "They know." By the following autumn, the program had expanded to 2 additional facilities in Montana and Idaho, and had been formally submitted to the Department of Defense as a model for nationwide adoption at military working dog transition facilities. Gerald Pratt had signed every document required of him. and had, in the process, quietly removed the laminated tour sheet from the east corridor wall. Cerberus was adopted in June by a retired Army medic in Billings who had 3 children under 10.25-acre yard and who sent Cole a photograph every month of the dog sleeping in the middle of the living room floor, surrounded by small people. The photograph was always slightly blurry because no one in that house held still long enough for a clear shot. Cole drove to Missoula on the first Saturday of every month. Lily's consolidation phase ended in September with results her oncologist described as excellent, a word he used with the specific restraint of a man who knows that words like that carry enormous weight and should not be deployed carelessly. On the Saturday after that appointment, Lily sat on the grass outside the Clearwater East Corridor with a 7-year-old German Shepherd named Ghost lying across her feet, his eyes half closed in the late autumn sun, his scar-notched ears moving slowly the way they did when he was somewhere he had decided was safe. Cole sat on a fence rail nearby and watched them, and did not check his phone. The nerve damage in his lower back had not improved, and would not. The paperwork for the program's federal review was considerable. The winter in Montana would arrive in 6 weeks and would be the particular kind of cold that makes every task harder without making any task unnecessary. None of this was lost on him. But there was something he had been carrying for 14 years that had begun, in small increments, to set down its own weight, not the service. Never the service, but the particular exhaustion of believing that the things he had seen and done had been moving in one direction only. Sitting on that fence rail in October, watching a dog who had survived 2 wars lie in the sun with a child who was surviving something else, Cole Maddox understood, with the plain and unfussy clarity he'd always preferred, that he had been wrong about the direction. Sometimes the world does not send its signs in ways we are prepared to read. Sometimes 12 retired military working dogs line up at a fence and press their muzzles into the palm of a child they have never met, and the sign is so clear that even the people whose job it was to prevent it end up signing the paperwork to make it permanent. God does not always announce the moment when things are about to change. He places a small girl in a parking lot, and an open gate, and 12 dogs who have spent their careers knowing things the reports didn't have language for, and he trusts the right person to be paying attention when it happens. In our ordinary days, we walk past the fences, we see the signs on the gates, and we move along the approved routes, and we carry our laminated instructions and believe they are the shape of what is possible. But sometimes, what is possible is already happening on the other side of the fence. Sometimes all it takes is one person who stops, crouches down, and asks, "How are you doing?" If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that grace moves in its own directions and cannot be rerouted by a policy. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And tell us this too. Have you ever been in a room when something happened that the rules said couldn't? Your story may be the one that opens a gate for someone else today. If you believe in the loyalty of those who serve on 4 legs and 2, and in the children who see them clearly, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next journey. May God bless you, protect your family, and keep your heart open to the signs that don't arrive with thunder, the ones that press their muzzle into your palm and wait for you to notice.